They don't use clapboards on podcasts, Michael. So. Yes.
I'm learning.
Trying to teach you. Come under my wing here, my friend. Yes. Okay.
All right, welcome everyone. I guess we should just go ahead and get started, and we'll just dive into the questions. So let's kind of talk about the genesis of the writing program.
Of course.
I know, you put a lot of work into it. How did that kind of form?
Well, I remember when I was on the main stage at Second City in like the early 90s, my ex-wife and I had a huge visa bill. I'm not kidding. And I had worked at Saturday Night Live before Second City. I had been a writer on Saturday Night Live, and then I was working as an actor and improviser at Second City. And so I taught a 4-week workshop in how to put together a Saturday Night Live sketch packet. And then that morphed into 8 weeks. And then I realized that improvisers, that our training is such that we don't necessarily write jokes, that our training is make the other person look good, and the humor arises organically from the relationships and the situations, and we don't sully our hands with the telling of jokes, which I think's a crock of shit. But I created how to write for a talk show in order to kind of teach joke writing and also how to pitch things, and which fed into SNL. And then the next organic step after that was to do a sitcom spec script. And then after It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia sort of made a name for itself, literary agents began to read pilots. Here's the thing about our program. It is designed specifically for the student to impress agents. Like, we teach what agents will read. And so, while you're in the process of doing that, you're also learning how to do the things. That there's a combination of art and commerce at work, which I think is very, very different from at least the sort of improv theater writing programs that I know of. And they, even I also teach at DePaul, and there's kind of a hesitancy to kind of talk about the nuts and bolts of writing, like how do you get a job? And so basically I created a program based on the I wish somebody had told me. Like it's entirely based on what I wish somebody had told me when I was coming up. Mm-hmm. And rather than having to spend years trying to figure out all of it. So it's currently 4 programs that feed into each other, although, as you know, we don't insist that you start with talk show, but talk show how to create a talk show portfolio, how to create a Saturday Night Live sketch packet, how to create a sitcom spec script, and how to write what we call a TV pilot presentation. And like I said, those are 4 things that literary agents, both in New York and Los Angeles, will read, and they will evaluate and sign you on as a client. So I'm happy to say, between the 4 classes that Howard and I teach, you leave with something tangible that you can use, as opposed to just ethereal concepts and comedy, which is great, but it's not what we're doing. We're also sort of hopefully helping you birth a career, I suppose.
That's what I tell my students also. That's the biggest difference between Michael's program and just about any other writing program out there. Any other TV writing program or stage writing program, they don't tell you the business side of things. They don't give you any kind of heads up. And that's what everybody wants to know.
Yeah.
So that's why Michael's program is so great. There's a lot of great writing programs out there. But say the Second City writing program, for example. The Second City writing program is great if you want to learn how to write for the Second City main stage. But if you want to learn how to get an agent, you got to go elsewhere. And this is the elsewhere, I guess.
Yeah. And I think in terms of putting together a concise curriculum, which is now like 300 pages per class, I think. I would much rather interview agents than necessarily, well, I would like to interview both TV producers and agents, but I'm far more interested in because agents know what's happening, like the ever-changing, it's like my agent says, more has happened in the last 6 months than in the last 50 years, that it's moving at this breakneck speed. And
right.
So rather than kind of be tied to some ancient business model, the idea is like hit the ground running and sort of have a look at what's happening now.
Yeah, my agents get a bad rap a lot of times, but, well, Michael's agent, for example, Michael Lewis, is wonderful because he knows what's going on in the industry, and he knows more about what's going on in the industry than just about anybody else that our students are ever going to come across. So he keeps up to date on that, and then he passes that down to Michael, and Michael filters it to me, and I filter it on to my students.
Yeah, he's British, so we automatically assign a huge amount of intelligence to his just when he opens his mouth, and immediately feel intimidated. But Howard's right. Like he really is, and very happy to talk about stuff like this.
Yeah. So a question I had on, you mentioned that this was something that you developed or wish you had known. Was it something that just happened organically? Were you just talking to other friends and they said, oh, I submitted a talk show packet or something like that? Or was it like an agent coming to you and saying, hey, I can really pitch this if you give me this?
Right. Tim Kazurinsky, who was a cast member on Saturday Night Live, I'd been an intern at Second City, and he saw some videotape of some sketches that I had shot, and he thought they were really good. And so he helped me put together my portfolio for SNL. And I learned a huge amount just in terms of exactly what the show was then. Mm-hmm. That's the thing, too, is it's evolved, and it's very different now. I mean, every year it changes a bit. And so my thing... and then I wrote for Sesame Street and other, but the idea was there are these universals, and you create a really funny sketch, but you succeed or fail based on the intrinsic qualities of whatever medium you're working in. So, Saturday Night Live is a very specific thing. Second City is a very specific thing, and if you're gonna, it's kind of noteworthy to just study those specific things rather than defend something you've just learned, or there's all sorts of. But let's see, to be practical, so I started teaching in '92. Well, the last year I was on the main stage, like I said, because my ex-wife and I had a visa bill. But then I just realized, and I think Second City realized too, the huge market that existed, like legitimate people. And then I went out to Los Angeles, and I did a bunch of stuff, including create a comedy festival in Ireland, because when I initially arrived in LA, I hated it. So, but then, I started to refine it and started to kind of see that it changed, so I started talking to agents, and then kind of when I wasn't looking, this became kind of my main focus, was to create this, create it and recreate it. If I could, I would love to do kind of a rewrite every year, because it does, I don't know if I have the energy. I've been working on this book since November of 2015, so that's a bit of a challenge.
Well, and I see with my students, once they they finish the 8-week program for talk show or SNL, if we did not have the business aspect to it, how do you get your agent aspect to it, they just would kind of drift. So this lets them focus a little bit more and realize, I got to keep rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. And finally, when I get this packet right and I get the agent letter right, I can actually do something with it. So the program goes on and on, even after the class ends, if you're doing it right.
I remember telling you this, one of the ideas that we have is something called $20,
yep, which
is, the buyer protection plan for our students, which is after you finish, say, the SNL class, we want to start maybe on Sundays having this 90-minute meeting of former students, and the idea would be that they would give me $20. I would put it in a Ziploc bag, and then they would say, this is what I'm going to complete in a week. And then they come back the following week and collect their $20. I'm not just taking $20 from them, but it's the idea of, like, I am going to write the first paragraph to my letter to an agent. So here's $20. You know, so it's a way of making it. And if you're sick, then we put it into a fund, and I don't know what we do with it.
Buy breakfast for everybody.
Yes, that's right. Really good coffee. But that, you know, the idea of, like, because no writer, or not many writers, want to do the commerce aspect of it. You know, like, everybody wants to avoid that. You know, just my thing is, everybody wants to be, you know, the Beatles, like having Brian Epstein take care of everything rather than, well, I mean, that's maybe a bad illustration because they worked very, very
We know how
hard.
Brian Epstein ended up, so.
Yeah, I used to talk about Brian Epstein a lot, and then a lawyer in the music industry pulled me aside once and said, you're aware that he made like the worst deals in the history of music. You know, they got screwed for years because of, but the idea being that, you know, the fantasy is somebody's going to come along and just do all that for us, and that's never the case. You know?
See, the thing of it is, if you're really good at creating art, you're probably really bad at business, and vice versa. So you got to find somebody that's, you know, people that are in the middle are the ones that don't get screwed and actually make money off of this stuff.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so behind the idea behind $20 is that, you know, visit it for like a half hour a week, and then you can have kind of control your destiny rather than just being the victim of, you know, because I think writers, it kind of goes hand in hand with being sensitive and artistic, is prone to martyrdom. Like, I'm a man out of time. I should have been born in the 1700s. Well, no, I failed them too.
Like, I'm the struggling artist. You recognize my pain.
Yeah, Van Gogh. I know. No, you don't.
So, to put a kind of percentage on it, what percentage of students would you both say kind of do one piece, let's say the art piece, but then don't follow through on the commerce piece?
Wow.
That's a good, I don't know, percentage-wise. But
You see, when the bad part is, once the students are through the program, they kind of go off into the world, and sometimes we hear from them, and sometimes we don't.
Oh, I just got a text message from a guy named Owen Smith,
Okay.
who's a student of mine in L.A., and he's an executive producer of a show called Cupcake Man on ABC. And he was kind enough to text me and say, hey, thank you, which is incredible.
Wow.
Yeah,
and
that's
very,
awesome.
very rare.
Yes.
And he was a stand-up, and he was, you know, so he took a couple of spec script classes. But there's like a growing number. I know Kay Cannon wrote a spec script in my class and ended up working on, well, Tina Fey's also one of her best friends, but we ended up working on 30 Rock. And I, like, going back to what Howard was saying about business, I really should collect all the names and, like, have them on a big banner in front of the class. But yeah, it's, one of the things about teaching at the I.O. is sometimes people are just taking the class to get a sense of, you know, like they're at the salad bar going, hey, I might have a knack for this, you know. So a lot of times, and also it helps, I think, round you out as an improviser too, if you have a clear sense of what the irony is, and, you know, which is similar in both pursuits and stuff. But there certainly are lots of successful people that have studied with us, and I should sit down and figure them out. But the idea of, I don't know if there's a standard, like, because show business is so random sometimes. It's not, you know, it's not doled out in a fair way, but there is kind of some universals about, you know, being clear on what you want.
Yeah, I mean, the thing of it is, with one of the things that makes these classes hard to teach, there aren't any particular prerequisites. We're very open to everybody. But the downside of that is you get people who have been doing stand-up for 10 or 12 years, and you get people who are accountants and are just bored as hell. And you mix them all together, and you've got to come up with a program that'll be engaging for all of them. And you adjust to, you know, what their skill levels are. And you want to be really encouraging to the people that are just starting out. And you also want to be really helpful to the people that have been doing comedy for a long time. And so how do you reconcile those? And it's tricky.
Yeah, man, that's exactly right. And a lot of times you find, and I'm sure Howard does it as well, is you spend a huge amount of time with the beginners, and then, you know, thinking that the, like, 10-year stand-up people can, or 10-year improviser people, or people with experience, you know, and they have questions, you know, that, I mean, it is kind of a challenge sometimes to do all that, but I find it enormously rewarding, and that's why I keep doing it, is it's, like, really good to kind of, because while you're, like, the cliche is I learn twice as much as the students and all that, but there is a kind of thing, if you have to codify what you believe and then revisit it every 8 weeks, you are constantly sort of updating it, and, you know, and the best thing, my wife, Susan Messing, has a great line about, if you're not having fun, you're the asshole. And I think that's a really good MO for teaching as well. Like, if you're not having fun, you're the asshole. Like, if I find myself being dictatorial or authoritarian, or, you know, then I have to kind of pause and recalibrate my approach to stuff.
But the best classes are the ones where everybody laughs a lot.
Yeah.
Because you're sitting around and you're reading jokes.
Yeah.
You know,
It's
so
supposed to be funny.
yeah, that's the idea behind it.
That's a good
So
point.
yeah, so everybody has a good experience if you can sit around, and it's always fun to walk in a class at the beginning of the 8 weeks, and everybody's sitting there stone silent, and by the 8th week, shut up! We got to start class. But yeah, I love these. I love these students. It's
I do
just
too.
really a great thing. And I'm doing this because of Michael. I got roped into this somehow, and it was just the best thing.
And well, it's not like I picked somebody randomly off the street. Howard's published a dozen books, and he's the Python's go-to biographer, and we've known each other since '87, I think.
At least.
Yeah, so it's a good team. Like I'm grateful beyond cope that Howard is shackled.
I'm so happy to be shackled, Michael.
Right.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Comedic teacher ball and chain.
Yeah.
So you mentioned this idea of like the sampling. So part of, I think, one of the philosophies you had was sample, choose, focus, and commit.
Oh, right.
And we talked about it in class, but we didn't really get to kind of dive into that.
Right, an acronym. I'm from Akron, Ohio, so it's fitting that I come up with an acronym. The sample, choose, focus, and commit is, well, one of the things I think for both Howard and I is we have a huge amount in common with our students, that we basically were them, you know, let's say 20 years ago.
Oh, 10, 12 years ago, maybe.
Right. So, like, typically, like knowing the Chicago route, you come to town, you know, you'd graduate from college, say, and you come to Chicago and you sample everything Chicago has to offer, which is enormous. Mm-hmm. So you do, you take a class at Second City, maybe The Annoyance, maybe I.O. You might even take a class at Steppenwolf. You might try open mics and do stand-up and spoken word. And there's just a huge amount of, because the city itself is unbelievably open to stuff like that. And then after a year, when you're trying, you're working a day job and realizing you're driving yourself crazy trying to do all these things, you kind of organically begin to limit what you're working on. And so that would be, you would go from sampling everything to choosing something. So say, for instance, you choose improv, and then you spend a while doing improv, and then you realize the world's kind of caving in on you. So you sample, choose, focus. You begin to focus, say, on just long-form improv. And then you do that for a while, and then you go even farther. And commit. You commit to it. So there is this kind of, these levels, I find, and constantly open to changing stuff, but the idea of sort of going through these things in order to get to the commitment stage, like that you're sure of it. And a lot of times people get very stuck, say, for instance, in the sampling, because it looks like you're moving forward, but you're not. You're just spinning your wheels. After a while, the idea of hypothetically finding something where you fit, you're just madly keeping busy as opposed to beginning to kind of go, this is my expertise. And our thing with writing is when you choose, if and when you choose writing and you're just writing, you cannot help but get better because you're not distracted. Like, how do you make a really funny, bright person useless? Give them two things to do. And my thing, and I have to constantly remind myself, I'm so much more effective if I go, one thing, then the next thing, then like I take one project and I finish it, and then I go on to the next project and the next project, as opposed to trying to do three things at once poorly. I mean, that might just be my OCD at work. I don't know. But I do find it very effective among my students, rather than, it's almost like some of our students, it's almost like we dare you to succeed. I mean, if you're filling your schedule up with all these things, you're doing all this work, like you're doing a bunch of different things, it is kind of like good luck, because, how do you become more effective? Well, you focus on one thing at a time.
I mean, when we tell students also, basically we give them all the information, all the tools they need to succeed. And I just get frustrated because I say, do exactly what I say when I say it, and you will make it in this business. And they don't do it for some reason. I
have such a nerd, geeky observation, which is, there's a Star Trek episode, and don't you love a sentence that called, I think it's called The Gorn, in which Captain Kirk comes, the Enterprise comes face to face with, I'm just sounds so geeky.
No, go on, go on.
Dig yourself up further. So this alien, they're about to kill each other in this battle in space. And this higher intelligence beams the two captains down to a planet, and they're going to fight, and that will decide. And at the end, Captain Kirk realizes that on the planet are the ingredients for a cannon, like there's gunpowder and sulfur and all of it. And so I contend, in my geeky way, that all around you are the tools for your success. You just have to be aware of them. You just have to go, oh, look, gunpowder, or whatever the TV writing equivalent is, and put these things together in order to kind of launch your career. And I have to come up with a better analogy.
No.
You can't blame one that starts with an episode of Star Trek.
Yeah. Just when I was at Comic-Con. Shut up.
I did want to touch on what makes a writing program good. So we kind of went over what IO does and the Comedy Lab that we have here. But are there any other kind of writing programs that you recommend? What are some of the things you're seeing, like, if someone does like an MFA course at NYU or something like that?
Oh, right.
Well, those are great because you can get rid of a lot of money, a lot of excess money, and just dump it all out there.
That's right.
As opposed to, any program where at the end you have something, you walk away with a stack of sketches or a script, anything where you actually produce something is fantastic.
Yeah, and a lot of times we find that in other programs that the reason they don't teach commerce is the teachers themselves have not done it. Like, have a look at the credits of the instructor, like, not to be mercenary, but that's the idea. Like, if you do what I say, you will not work as I am not working. That's the kind of endorsement.
Right.
And the thing with Howard and I is, like, again, what do we wish somebody had told us? that's not a bad compass through all of that, you know. And then also, like Howard was saying, you have stuff that you can, you know, here, send this to an agent. Well, my thing is develop a relationship with an agent. Do not send them a cover letter with your work. You know, that's not the way it works. Is you know, we have them write a generic letter to an agent, then a specific letter to an agent, and, you know, the way you figure out what agent might work for you is what's your favorite show, what's your favorite episode, who wrote your favorite episode, and who represents that writer. And then you begin to get in touch with them, and you're not crazy. It's not like you send a letter every day. Why'd you wear that shirt? You know, that kind of stalker stuff. Oh, I want to sue Paramount. You know, like, they're stealing my ideas. That's why I wear this aluminum hat, you know. But the idea is, like, keep them, develop it. Go like, I'm at the I.O., I'm studying this, and, you know, I would love for you to read my stuff, and I'd love to take your notes, and, you know, and it's been my experience, like, if they're not crazy, the agent will talk to them. You know, they're in business to find clients anyway, you know.
Yeah, and if they, and I always tell my students, don't get discouraged if the agent doesn't respond, if they don't think you're funny, because that's not the right person for you. It's a search. You've got to beat the bushes to find the right agent for you. Because do you really want to be represented by somebody that doesn't think you're funny? Yeah. Oh, I can make a lot of money off of him. I don't like these jokes. This is a terrible sketch, but I can make money off of it. No. You got to find somebody in sync with you.
And one of the, just that sort of what's your favorite show scenario is at least you have something in common. Like you both like his or her client, the agent's client. So that's not a bad crapshoot, at least.
Right.
It's a good starting point.
Yeah,
all right. Yeah.
And you would know like the type of humor they like and are kind of attuned to versus just somebody that you find.
Right. That you desperately sort of. And there's like having lived 19 years in LA, like there's stuff that I've included in the curriculum that sort of this is how it works stuff, like in terms of agents, but it's kind of like Howard's joking about how do I give away a lot of money. Let me take it, have a look at the results of those. I also teach at DePaul, and DePaul has a fairly good sense of like how things work, and I would say for the most part they're very good at film. Like, and TV is kind of this weird redheaded stepchild. A lot of times gets misunderstood, but I think it's like I used to joke about TV writing was art, but with a small a, and I don't think that anymore. I think it's incredibly powerful. When it's done right. It's it sways elections. It does. There's a lot of real good and I suppose bad stuff equally that can be done with it, but it's powerful. And I give it up going strategic, self-effacing descriptions of my profession as like art with a small a. I don't think that's true anymore.
Yeah, I think that there's no limits to TV anymore because nobody knows what's going on. Streaming is about to just explode. Yeah. I mean, it's already big, but it used to be a 22-minute script or 24-minute script, with commercial breaks, and you've got to do it like this and this and this, and everything was really rigid and laid out for you. Now, anything and everything goes. And, some of the things that are the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. You pitched a 1950s-based story of a woman who wanted to become a comic in the 1950s, and Lenny Bruce is one of the ongoing characters. Yeah, they'd look at you like you had three heads.
God, yeah, right. Yeah. Lenny Bruce basically playing the role of the Greek chorus is just such a brilliant, wonderful moment. The guy, he's a Canadian actor, but he plays him amazingly well.
Yeah, nothing like the real Lenny Bruce, but but he works in the context of the show.
Yeah, like but Howard's right, is that, and things can continue to change, but there's also kind of the essence of storytelling. Like, here are the things that that go back to Aristotle in terms of, pathos and, character, story, all of it. So it's the combination of kind of going, like Howard was saying about streaming is exploding, and then also, but like I have a lot of times I have students that'll come in and go, I got equipment for the weekend. I'm going to shoot a webisode. Well, what is it going to be about? I don't know. My friends and I live in an apartment, and it's really funny. Well, really? Good luck.
Yeah. Yep.
No, because I got this one. He's really sloppy. No kidding. Okay.
You don't say.
Yeah. I can't wait to see it.
So, yeah, it's you don't need stories nowadays, right?
Yeah,
you just take a camera up to this apartment and it writes itself.
It writes itself. It's the best
my
line.
God.
Yeah.
If I've learned anything, it will not write itself.
I was getting the sense that I was watching one of my favorite sitcoms episodes, and
Oh, yeah.
I get like we talk in class about like the big thing at what's like the North Star of your show, and I feel like in that series, it's basically saying writers are important. Writers kind of make things happen. Like actors and producers get most of the credit, but writers kind of are like the engine
Right.
of driving this like creative force in Hollywood. I mean, just my perception based on that show. I don't know.
And
how
a lot of
accurate it is.
times unsung, they're sort of quiet and. Well, remember when modesty was actually. Before this administration, that being modest was actually a good thing as opposed to, I'm a stable genius. All that, that where boorishness was not a personality asset, But I think writers, and it depends upon, sitcom with a staff versus like hour-long where you're a single writer and kind of turning in rewrites to a producer. Like, there's a different vibe to that, but it's all storytelling. And the idea of, trying to be original and trying, truly original, and is always, like, my experience has been, like, there's a tendency to make fun of agents and producers and network executives and development people. Like, I have never met a stupid agent. They're alienated from their point of view. They're alienated from their taste because they're hyper aware of the business. But they're never stupid. They're like some of the best read people I've ever met. You really have to have your ducks in a row when you go into whatever pitch or whatever, because they're wise. They are. And so that kind of, realizing that in its clumsy, and I think that right now various people are holding on to old business models, and perhaps we are too, I don't know, but the idea is to be open to whatever's happening rather than being guarded about, that somehow we're in charge of keeping everything the same, and which we're not.
You got to embrace change. That's
Yeah.
the one thing that is going to happen. It's inevitable, and people that fight it turn out to be conservatives, and
Yeah, and it's crazy, what is the line about history is going to leave you behind, or whatever and pretty quickly too these days, like
faster than ever.
yeah,
Oh yeah.
that that I think we're certainly in a period of reevaluation of everything, because everything's up for grabs in a sense, but I think storytelling will still remain the same. Good stories are the key, the sort of GPS through all of this is good stories.
I mean, stories haven't changed since the cavemen used to sit around the campfire and tell each other stories. We all, and there's something innately human about that. Humans like to be told stories, like to be entertained, and like to hear stories.
Gilgamesh, was that the first? I remember reading the very first recorded story was
I think that's the first written
Gilgamesh.
story.
But
Yeah.
then there's also like two guys walk into a bar.
But it's all valid.
Yeah.
It's all good. But yeah, but writers just never really have gotten the recognition that they deserve. I mean, they just don't. It's
That's why they
Del-
become directors.
Yeah, which overcompensates the other way.
Right.
Del used to tell a joke. There used to be Polish jokes, so apologies because this is very un-PC, but he always used to talk about the Polish actress who wanted to get into show business and screwed the writers. So, yeah, writers just, that's the reason so much of this has come about as far as the whole fire your agents thing. You know, the Writers Guild advised all of its members to fire their agents, and that's all because of packaging of movies.
Yeah.
Because the large agencies, we're not talking about the boutique agencies, the smaller ones, the partnerships, but the big agencies, they would package movies. They'd get the stars together. They'd get a director. They'd get the producers, and then they'd get a script. And they would cut the deals with the studios for the stars and the producer and the director and the writers. Well, guess who got the short end of the stick there? Mm-hmm. You know, nobody wants to pay the writers more. They're not going to fight as much for the writers. So that's why this whole thing came about. And that's all being renegotiated even as we speak. But writers have traditionally not gotten the respect, I say, as a writer.
Yeah,
So,
I agree. And the, I'm very proud of the WGA. Like, I've been a member since '83, and it's like the first time they've actually, I mean, we've gone on strike 3 times since I've been a member, and it's always kind of like for diminished returns. It's like, do you understand what a strike is? Oh, okay. But now, awesome.
So for new students that want to transition into Hollywood, how does that WGA ATA standoff kind of affect how they get agents? Would you still say go get an agent regardless? I mean, even though, you know.
Well, the ones that are on the list, you know, that remain are not guilty of avarice and greed like the big ones, like CAA, APA, and all those. And I love the fact that they're stymied, you know, those, because you always have to kind of crawl into them. You know, like I was with APA and I was with ICM, and they, you know, it's intimidating, you know.
Yeah.
But now there's still a list of 4 or 5 pages long. You can see it on the website, on the WGA website, of acceptable agencies that have not done this packaging thing that Howard was talking about. And those, I would say, go after those. You know, in fact, if you're starting out, it's probably good to start at the lower. I mean, granted, the scenario that I illustrated before about what's my favorite show, what's my favorite episode, what's my favorite writer, and who represents that writer is kind of, might take you to ICM or CAA. But they're more apt to read you, I would say, the smaller agencies. So this is kind of a good time to submit.
Yeah, I don't think a beginning writer is likely to be signed by CAA right out of the gate.
No, that would give them radiation poisoning. Need to be kind of armed, like a lead vest.
All right, so I think the next kind of topic we want to hit is the pipeline of current comedy writers. So I know we'd mentioned in class that there's usually like a core group of writers in the writer's room. Typically it'll be some stand-up comics, some journalists, ex-journalists, and then people who are just like natural writers that go through a writing program.
Yeah.
Does any kind of position or your background lend to being better at a certain task in the writer's room? Like,
well, there are basically a sitcom writer's room would be divided into 2 groups, which would be the idea people coming up with stories, and then joke people who are adept at creating jokes given a scene or something, they can punch it up. And a great way to kind of, so if like you think about the classes as the microcosm of that macrocosm, the small, you know, what I think you get into trouble assigning any broad generalization, because I'm constantly amazed at, like, typically what happens is, like, I'll have sort of quiet students, and I'll think, we're not getting it, or I'm not getting through to them, or
Right.
And then they'll bring in their stuff, and it'll be amazing. and then sort of the fast talking. No, I understand what you're saying. They'll be late. They won't turn stuff in, and they'll be like, and then when they do, it's horrible, misogynist or homophobic or like racist or terrible. Like, so I've learned not to think that way. Like, oh, you're from this group, so you're going to be funny. Like, whether it's Eastern educated, or there's all sorts of groups. Improvise. If you're a good improviser, you're a good writer. Not necessarily. Like it's a. So my thing is just to kind of try my best to be completely even with my presentation, and then also just not be too. Hopefully, not be too surprised when somebody quiet actually ends up being. But like if you look at like Laughter on the 23rd Floor, which is not a bad X-ray into a writing staff. Neil Simon's romantic version of Sid Caesar. He has all those elements. The quiet person, the Mel Brooks character, the fast talking, 100 jokes a minute. And I think it's a balance of those two things. You want to have, and you want other people to respect the thing that they're not doing. To have, like, if you're a joke person, to actually see the need for the story people and vice versa. It's when those lines of demarcation are drawn that it's just horrible. It becomes deadly when you're competing and at loggerheads.
Yeah, I think, friends of Michael and mine come to mind. Joey Gutierrez and Diane Burrows were a team for a long time. They created Still Standing. They wrote countless sitcoms. And the thing that strikes me about him is Joey is so great. He was a stand-up, and he's so great at jokes. And Diane was really great at story construction. And those are the two skills, and that's why they were so successful for so long, because they each brought it all together.
That's a great example. Those two really are, together they're a complete human being.
Yeah. And I didn't think of this before, but if you watched the old Dick Van Dyke Show, I mean, you had Sally and Buddy and Rob.
Yeah.
And Buddy was like a joke a minute. And you didn't really see the whole story part of it coming together with...
Why does a hummingbird hum? Because it doesn't know the words.
Yeah, but you can see the whole microcosm of a writer's room just with those three, I think.
You're right. Those are archetypes. That's very true.
Yeah.
And really transcended to have Rosemarie there. Like, I think that kind of introduced the concept. Like, one thing I always say about, because a lot of times people, like, I'll bump into people that will say, it can't be taught. It's just kind of God-given. And usually that's coming from fairly insecure people who don't want you to do this, because you're going to take business from me or something. And my thing is, like, people get discouraged when they look ahead and they don't see anybody that physically resembles them succeeding. Which was what I love about the time we're in, is that there's this, it's way more open than it has been to women and to, non-straight white men. And I don't mean to go against my own demographic, but I find it amazingly, really a marketplace of ideas right now. And I love watching stuff that I could not have created. Because one of the things, that we do is like write a scene, for instance, where nobody else could have written it but you, and really celebrating that rather than going, no, it's got to be, it's got to be our our similar, just my, here's what's funny. Write this down. Clowns are really funny. Clowns.
Yeah, it's so great. I love to walk into a classroom at the beginning of a term and just see diversity all over the place, because I'm so sick. I mean, I've been hearing straight white men come up with ideas for a long time. And I tell people, write what you know. Write your own background. Write your experiences. And it's always way more interesting than anything that they would have come up with otherwise if they were trying to write for straight white men.
Like David's thing with Seinfeld, it has to have happened to you.
Yes.
That's awesome. That's a very good first domino.
I think so.
Stuck in an elevator. The boss is coming home for dinner. Like, imagine. Can you imagine? What are you going to feed him? Write itself. Or it doesn't write itself.
He's a vegan.
He said, that's the twist. It's the twist.
Makes it really 2019.
Yeah. He gets jury duty. It just came in the mail. Jury duty.
I know a guy that happened to.
Yeah. Friend of mine. I can't remember. What was the other one to me? Was the cliche? Oh, bachelor auction. That was the other one. Big bachelor auction. Right, all right.
Yeah.
So we talked about Howard's background, about Monty Python. So I'm going to ask just for the folks listening, like your best Hollywood story, or even a Monty Python kind of what happened while you're there.
Oh, God. Well, I can tell you want a name-dropping type story, you mean?
Sure. I think we have.
Would you like fries?
Well, I was just thinking about this because this was something that happened many years ago. As we speak right now, yesterday was the 30th anniversary of the day we lost Graham Chapman from Monty Python. And so I was thinking back on Graham a little more than typically. But I was so lucky to get to know him as well as I did. And, yeah, I worked on Life of Brian. And after that, that really cemented the friendships with me and the Python guys. And whenever they would pass through Chicago in the 80s, I would usually get together with them for dinner, drinks, coffee, whatever. And
may I interrupt? Because I'm going to forget this. Because Howard's not going to tell you this. But on his own dime, he flew to Tunisia. And when he showed up on the film set, they all went, "What the fuck?" And they immediately gave him a job. And, like, one of my favorite things is to watch Life of Brian with Howard, because he'll stop and he'll go, "Oh, look, I'm playing a centurion. Oh, look, I'm playing a Jewish woman. Oh, look."
Proud of being able to say I played more roles than John Cleese, I think, in the roles. And John is very happy about that also. But it's all true. Yeah. So anyway, Graham used to come through town quite a bit, and a lot of Graham stories. But one of the best weekends was one of the last ones. I was performing at Cross Currents with the Barons Barracudas. Del directed us, of course. And we ended up, Graham was doing a show at the Park West, I think, and he came to the show the first night, our show, and then he came after his show ended, and it was the same night that Billy Murray was there, and Del was there as well, and we were all talking just after the show, and we decided just pretty spontaneously, well, we'll all go over to my place and just have a little get-together. And so we had this party. We got a case or two of Old Style because it was Chicago. And I had, I don't know, maybe another dozen students came along because some of us weren't doing the Herald afterwards. And so we all split over to my place first. I lived in this little rat hole apartment on North Racine. The rent was $270 a month. Wow. But I only paid half of that because my roommate paid the other half. So this gives you some kind of a context for what we were going into. But Del didn't care, Graham didn't care, Billy didn't care, and so it was probably the best party I've ever had, just because they were all sitting around telling showbiz stories, and all the students that came by, they're just sitting there, their mouths are hanging open. And I was really proud because at that point, Graham was trying to get a film project going, and he was trying to get casting, and there were a couple of small parts that he wasn't able to cast yet. And so at that point, he asked Billy Murray, and he asked Del, would you play these two delivery men? Sure. Oh, yeah, happy to do it. So they just made the deal right then and there. And Graham left not too long afterwards, very happy. I remember Graham's foster son was with him, too. And at one point, they were sitting around, and John Tomachek looked at his watch. He said, boy, it's really late. We got a really early flight. And Graham checks, yeah, I know. Well, we can probably just sleep on the plane. So they stayed another hour or two. And they split, and eventually Dell and Billy split, and the place was overrun by all these other students, and it was a good time was had by all. And I found out later, I saw an interview with Graham, where the writer said, well, they'd just gotten back from Chicago, where they talked about a party they were at with Bill Murray. Yeah. So I feel like that was really a nice thing I was able to do, is pay back Graham by getting Billy and Dell in his movie.
Nice.
The movie never happened, of course, because Graham got sick not long after that. But it gave him some good thoughts and helped him get the project together.
It's also a very Chicago story, like the description of the party versus I met him at a party, and so the Hollywood image is martinis by a pool versus in that. I remember that apartment of yours.
Oh yeah.
Howard had the albatross from when the Pythons did a blackout where John. But he had, Howard can describe it better than me, but above his refrigerator was this huge, dusty albatross.
Filthy.
Which was just like a gargoyle looking down upon. It was where suddenly John Cleese was in the audience going, albatross, beer. He's trying to sell albatross. Did you get wafers with it? No, bloody wafers with it.
Ward off the roommates that want to steal food.
Yeah.
Remember the albatross is looking at you.
Because I lived at Racine and Cornelia, so I lived right around the corner from Howard.
And we used to run together.
Yes.
Yes.
Boy, back in that I could run now. I will, damn it.
Yes, you will. You were walking just fine.
Right, I forgot. You would run around Cornelia and then Addison, and then we spent at least 10, 12 minutes. And they got very pissy about, wow, I haven't seen any changes. I guess I won't try it anymore.
Yeah.
So, Michael, Eddie Murphy's coming back to SNL.
He is. That's great.
So, in honor of that, can you tell us a story of when you were on SNL?
Oh, an Eddie Murphy story?
Yeah.
Oh, man. Well, I'll tell you, I'm a huge fan of his. But the very first week that I was at read-through, I forget who was hosting, but Eddie came in. I think he's younger than me. And he had a huge entourage. And it was sort of like, the opening scene from the opera Aida. Carrying him in on a. So it just kept coming and coming. It was like maybe a dozen guys, and so Eddie, in the read-through, laid on his back, and would read the scripts and toss them over his head. And I thought to myself, this is my first week. I went, "You ungrateful person! How dare you? How dare you?" Mm-hmm. And then after 4 weeks of dealing with Saturday Night Live and the current administration back then and all the, getting to know the show and all that, Eddie was my hero. He went from being this ungrateful snob to oh man, you're so right. I love the fact that you can, get away with that rather than. But he was always this sounds cliche, but he was really, really nice to me. Always really helpful and willing to do anything. And it wasn't me. I think it was Jim Downey who said he described Eddie as a genius. And he's right, because, for instance, Saturday Night Live has a dress rehearsal and then live. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes, like an actor will torpedo a scene if they're not getting enough laughs or they don't think it's good enough, so it gets cut from dress, so they don't have to do it in live. And what Jim was talking about was that if a scene got on the air that Eddie didn't like, he committed. He made it work. That's where his genius was. It was all right, I have to make this work. And he would, you would just watch this amazing thing happen where suddenly it became 10 times better than when you wrote it. And that was very true of a couple of my scenes that he did. And he was kind of half there and half not, because he was shooting a movie at the time called Best Defense, which was a horrible movie. And they were shooting it in Israel, and he was flying back and forth. So we did this. We did a regular show of probably 8 or 10 scenes,
Mm-hmm.
and then we would drop them in when Eddie wasn't there. These pre-recorded live scenes, and that's where James Brown's hot tub was one of those scenes, and there's like some fairly classic Eddie Murphy things that were dropped in, but he, that genius was apparent. I understand. Somebody told me yesterday that he's doing Dolomite. Like, I can't wait to see that. Like, I feel like maybe he's coming back from pretentious mountain. He's coming back to like comedy because he's incredibly talented, and I'm so glad that Lorne Michaels and Eddie have kissed and made up or whatever.
Oh, there was beef there. I didn't realize there was.
I think there was. Like, he wasn't at the.
Well, he didn't work for Lorne when you were there.
Right.
Lorne wasn't involved.
Right. We were both Dick Ebersol under the, which was tricky. I wish I could say that I worked for Lorne Michaels, but I mean, I'm grateful for having worked there and all the trouble that Tim Kazurinsky went through to get me my job. But it was, Saturday Night Live at that time was being run by Dick Ebersol, who's a sports guy. So there was a lot of times there was some unevenness about the show, which I can't explain or defend. But Eddie, Eddie and his ersatz competitive partner Joe Piscopo were part of my time there.
Nice.
And also Julia Louis-Dreyfus was in the cast, and Tim Kazurinsky, a lot of incredibly talented people and really good writers on the Pam Norris and Andrew Smith. They're like, I learned, well, that's the thing, is you learn a huge amount of stuff in the space of a week because you're under, it's combat. It's like, it really is like you're on a rocket sled. I know that, what's her name from Fleabag is hosting tonight. And I forget her name.
Phoebe Waller-Bridge.
Right, thank you. And she was on Seth Meyers talking about, nobody told me. Well, Seth Meyers knows what it's like. My God, he was the head writer for 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
And he was just enjoying her sort of British take on this absolute chaos is what it is, particularly Saturday day, when you're doing, dress rehearsal and all of that. It's just...
I remind my students that famous Lorne Michaels quote, the show doesn't go on because it's ready. It goes on because it's 11:30 on Saturday night.
That's great.
So that's why it turns out the way it does
There's
some
a
of the
great
time.
line, too, from the South Park, the 6 Days to Air, where he talks about, Trey Parker talks about how they could continue to fiddle with it and maybe take 4 weeks rather than 6 days, and it would be maybe 5 or 6% better. And that's really true. Like, because you'll overthink everything if you have the time. And, and there's something about, like, no, now.
Yeah.
Well, Eric Idle always, who hosted a number of times in the early days, he always said that, the show just, if it wasn't live, it'd be a really great show. And, if it was an hour long and they had time to rehearse it and time to write, spend more time on the writing. And he's right. But, it would lose something. It would lose an awful lot. I think people forgive so much because it is being done live, because it's feels more spontaneous.
And you tune in to see the mistakes. Like, sometimes that's really fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if A.D. Bryant's dresser runs on stage and she starts cracking up, things like that.
Yeah.
So it's one of the parts of the show that's just, it makes it what it is.
God, Howard, I remember the first time Eric hosted the musical guest was Kate Bush, and I just so fell in love with her. Like, I was just, my family would make fun of me as I would play her albums. Who's that woman? It sounded like the Islamic call to worship.
My favorite Eric story, Kate was wonderful. My favorite Eric story was the week that Bob Dylan was musical guest, I think. But Eric got sick. He got really sick on show day. And he had to rewrite the opening. He rewrote the opening monologue because he was in horrible shape. He had 102-degree fever. but the show had to go on, of course. So he wrote, instead of the monologue they prepared, he wrote stretcher monologue, or stretcher impressions, or whatever. So they brought him out, strapped to a stretcher, and they would, move him around on the stretcher, flip him upside down. And the whole thing was written, just a few hours before it went out on the air. And it was great. It was really wonderful. But that's how the show comes together. And it's just crazy. And sometimes it works against all odds. And other times, it doesn't.
The idea of options, like a lot of times having options is debilitating. Like what can we do? I might make... I think that's one of the things that I loved about punk, the musical movement of punk rock, was just cutting to the chase rather than 1,000 hours of overdubbing in the studio and all that. That can actually become not good. Like rather than overdub, just go kick in a speaker.
Yeah.
You want that raspy sound? There you go.
All right. So let's move on to our segment dailies. So dailies is a big part of the writing process, sharing your work with others. So one of the biggest hurdles with new writers is this last bit before you get notes or feedback. Once you give your work to others and share it, it kind of moves past this imaginary Maginot line of things in my head and works in progress to being there, with something that has intent and commitment. So we're going to do dailies on our show. Of course, this is an homage back to when we had to send executives something every day. So we're going to, bite the bullet here and practice what we preach. So we're each going to go and do a little bit of what we're working on.
Great.
Pressure. Okay, let me find...
I'll look for one you're going to... I wrote something this morning knowing that this was... So forgive me, it's very much a first draft. It's funny to come off as some kind of an authority and not going to be this horrible thing.
All right. I'll go first because I've got this right here. I'm working on a play. This is based on the life of Del Close. And this is... Let me find this. Yeah, Del was at an audition, and they said, "Tell us about yourself, Del." And the director says, "So what's the trick to sword swallowing?" And Del says, "There's no trick. I learned from Whitey the albino sword swallower. You eat a big helping of mashed potatoes to weigh down your stomach so you could push the sword in further. But you always have to fight your own natural gag reflex." Director says, "Continue." So Whitey was obsessed with trying to prove it wasn't a fake. He made a sword out of a thin fluorescent tube. He'd swallow it and then light it up. You would see it glowing all the way down. One day the act went wrong and the tube broke, and there was broken glass up and down his esophagus. Nothing could be done. The other carnies didn't want to take Whitey to the hospital. That was for townies. They gave Whitey an overdose of morphine, which killed him, and then they buried him quietly. That was when I decided to leave the carnival. Now, one time, the carnival had to share space with a company that did stunts with cars. I volunteered to be strapped to the hood of an old car and driven through a brick wall. It was made to give way so no one would get hurt. But even if you were hurt, if you broke an ankle or a leg, you jumped up and went ta-da to the audience, and then got off before you collapsed. Never let the rubes see you hurt. It might cause a panic and wreck the show.
Awesome.
All right. That's Del.
Can you imagine directors in Second City now with that kind of...
They would be terrified.
Yeah, man.
Oh.
God. Well, I feel intimidated going after that wonderful thing.
Oh, no.
This is, like I was saying earlier, I'm recovering from cancer, and so my performing range is limited to, like I said, the Elephant Man or Stephen Hawking. So I picked, I guess the third choice would be FDR. So this is something I'm going to try to shoot in black and white and make it look like a film from the 30s, but I'm calling it Not a Fireside Chat. Forgive my impression. Good evening. I'd like to speak with you concerning a term which is now entering the popular lexicon, the phrase stable genius, which originated out of the pie hole of the current commander-in-chief, who seems incapable of filtering his thoughts, sending each one unexamined into the ether, as if they were precious, precious gems to be caught and saved by an adoring public. Such is not the case. Just because you think it does not make it so. And you can tell yourself whatever you want, believing that somehow, imbued with your more evolved sensibility, but you are not. I'm sorry, that's... let me switch gears. So, you can tell yourself whatever you want, believing that you are somehow imbued with a more evolved sensibility, but you are not. Eleanor and I were just discussing this the other day as she was reading one of the man's twats. Even though I've both warned her and implored her not to read these horrible, horrible missives, she persists, like the reading equivalent to staring at the wreck of an automobile. If said automobile were painted day-glow orange and was being driven by a 6-year-old child of the corn. But I digress. From high atop my aristocratic perspective, I have this to say about the use of the term stable genius. There are 3 things I know to be true. 1, you cannot describe yourself as smart. 2, you cannot describe yourself as funny. And 3, you cannot give yourself a nickname. These are traits and monikers others present to you. Not that you announce and declare to the world at large. If I awoke one morning and turned to Eleanor and told her that I'd taken a nickname, from now on I wanted to be known as Scooter, or Sparky, or Monstercock, she would divorce me and take up with someone else. The same is true of the self-declaration of intelligence and or a sense of humor. If you truly believe you're a, quote, stable genius, my advice is to depart from your current locale, employing a prescription for self-fornication. Such is the gravity of this illusion. Until next time, this is not a fireside chat. Thank you, guys.
Oh, I love it. Oh, wonderful. And a great FDR, too. Who knew?
So kind.
I didn't know.
You need to see more FDR. Thank you, though. Oh, my God. The real Roosevelt quotes are just horrible.
Yeah.
Like my dad would always say, the thing when Joe Kennedy was made ambassador to London, Roosevelt's line was, "That ought to wash the Irish out of him." And there was just there's loads more that I dare not repeat.
Yeah, some of these don't hold up quite as well,
Man.
do they? It's odd. Yeah.
But anyway, the Times he did some good stuff too.
All right, so what I'm working on is essentially the opening monologue for Lily Singh, who now has a show on late night television. So this is her hosting the White House Correspondents' Dinner.
Oh.
So, platitudes, thank you for having me, etc., etc. Now, I know some of you are thinking, why have a Canadian comic roast politicians on a Saturday night, right? My response is, you should be pretty used to it. Lorne Michaels pretty much built a whole career out of it. Also, if you're worried about tonight, we are in for a great night, and all the non-millennials need to buckle up and pull yourselves up by your bootstraps and stop being triggered boomers. My thanks to the DC Hilton for hosting this event, The White House Correspondents' Dinner has been held in the Washington Hilton for the past 20 years. It seems every host and most of the attendees have commented on it. Some would say it's run down and kind of disheartening. Nope, sorry, that's just the state of American politics. But why at the Hilton? You know the president has a hotel. I'm sure he could have hooked us up, unless there's something wrong with owning a place as a public official and then... Never mind. Real talk, though, the most powerful people in the world gather together in this room every year and complain about the venue. And if you ever need an example of how powerless our politicians are, book your seats in advance for next year's White House Correspondents' Dinner. Seriously, this place is so run down that I needed to print these jokes before we started. And I was asked for my loyalty number by management, something which I now have in common with journalists. That joke would have killed before print was dead. Now it's going to be a BuzzFeed quiz. Which unemployment line should a journalist walk into? Also, let's talk about this trade war with Canada. I know you don't want no beef with us, especially this prime Alberta grass-fed beef that's actually reasonably priced for American families. Some say our cows are happier because Canadians in general are nicer. Others say our cows are happier because they have a single-payer health system. Who knows? It's impossible to tell, really. Now, the president wants to renegotiate NAFTA for a better deal for America. You don't need to renegotiate. You have a great deal. First of all, Canada did not dump timber at low prices. Everyone knows those trees were gently placed on American soil, and in exchange, you got two of our best actors named Ryan and literally Superwoman. And we got Sarah McLachlan to stop making those damn Animal commercials. What more do you need? Now, there's a ton of Republicans here tonight, and as a Canadian, I just don't understand how your party formed. How did you create a whole party out of people suspicious of free stuff? Did you all meet at a flea market in 1854 and someone tricked the whole group into liking guns but hating rules? And how is it that the most pro-life party has a habit of killing things in small committees? Of course, I don't understand Democrats either. You all seriously fell asleep at the wheel. Apparently, for the last 25 years, Republicans have redrawn state election districts so that no matter how many Democrats live in a state, Republicans are in control of the state house, the Senate, and the governor's office. You messed that up so bad that if you had kids and lived alone, we'd be touring an assisted living facility right now. Welcome to the Quality Life Senior U.S. Senate community. Now, much has been made of the president's engagement with the Indian community, especially when compared to his predecessor. Obama had Cal Penn, an actual Hollywood actor who turned down millions to work in the Oval Office. Trump has Raj Shah, who turned down his mother's offer to live in her basement. Even now, his mother says, "Raj, you couldn't find a nice president to work for? Gal found a nice president." And that's what I have to say.
Great.
Nice.
Thank you.
I don't know. Americans of Indian extraction might be upset at you. I think it's a little different you doing it than me.
I'd work on the accent.
Yeah,
though,
yeah,
I
right,
think.
right. Stick with stuff you know.
The Michael McCarthy Comedy Lab podcast is executive produced by Michael McCarthy, Howard Johnson, and Ankur Patel, and is produced by Catherine Coates, Ian Iverson, Jonders, and Joseph Watahovich. Our theme music is produced by Cosmic, and artwork is by Ray Glass. This episode was recorded at the I.O. Theater. The I.O. Theater is home to Chicago's best improv comedy, with shows 7 nights a week. They offer classes in improv, writing, and more. Visit ioimprov.com for a full schedule.